Shalom, shalom. Hear, O Israel, is Romans chapter 14 breakdown. Giving all honor and glory to Yahweh Bashim Yahushai. Let's get right into it. This book of Romans chapter 14 verse 1. And it reads, Him that is weak in the faith receive you, but not to doubtful disputations. Verse 2, For one believeth that he may eat all things, another who is weak eateth herbs. So, Paul in this chapter, he's addressing these Jews and these Gentiles. Again, the previous chapter was regarding the hierarchy in these churches that Paul had established through the apostles and the elders in Jerusalem. And that was through Hamashiach Yahushai. So the previous chapter is speaking on the hierarchy of the Great Commission through Yahushai Hamashiach, the 12 apostles and the elders, and Paul establishing that through these deacons and these elders in these churches in the time of the Greeks and the Romans. So again, that chapter was speaking on the hierarchy. Now we're on chapter 14, and again you have to keep in mind Paul is speaking to two different modes of thinking. The mind of the practicing Jew and the Gentile, the Israelite foreigner. So if you've seen the previous two videos, you know that chapter 12 spoke on the conduct that these Jews and Gentiles were to have around the non-believing Jews and also those that they were under, which were these Romans, these heathens of another nation. Not those that were in the church in Rome. You have to distinguish and separate those two. So chapter 12, Paul is speaking on how these Jews, these practicing Jews and these Israelite foreigners, how to conduct themselves in the midst of their people, which were still caught up in these pagan practices and customs. So again, this also applies to today. Chapter 12, on how we should conduct ourselves amongst those that are still lost in other philosophies, doctrines, religions, Christianity, Catholicism, Islam, all these man-made religions, and how we're to conduct ourselves to them to show the proper example. Now, chapter 4, again, you have to keep in mind, Paul is speaking to the mindset of the Jew and the Gentile, the Israelite foreigner, returning back into the fold during this time. So, let's continue in verse 3. Let not him that eateth despise him that eateth not, and let not him which eateth not judge him that eateth, for God hath received him. So again, Paul is speaking and addressing the knowledge that these Jews had, which it is well known that in the Torah and the Jews that were well versed in the Torah. So let's address first the fact that in verse 2, he's speaking on one that may believe that he may eat all things, and another who is weak, who eateth herbs. So let's go to the first precept. This book of Genesis, chapter 9, and verse 3. And it reads, Every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you, even as a green herb have I given you all things. So again, these Jews that had grown up learning the Torah and the first oracles of the Most High Yahweh Bashim Yahushai, their interpretation of this verse was that you can only eat green herbs. And verse 4, But flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall you not eat. So also, this was also up for interpretation, because it is saying that the flesh with the blood which is the life, you shall not eat. So again, that was up for disputation and interpretation. And Paul, being a son of a Pharisee, was aware of this fact. This is why, again, in the epistles, in all his epistles, he's addressing two different mindsets. The mindset of the practicing Jew, which was well versed in the Torah, in the law, the prophets, and also these Israelite foreigners who were not well versed in these things, but were slowly coming to the fold, getting built up in the knowledge of the scriptures. This is why Paul, the constantly is speaking on charity, on edifying, and we'll go through it in this chapter also. Because again, if you watch the previous video, Romans 13 and 8 on down, he's speaking on how these elders and these leaders, and actually starting at verse 4, 13 and 4, how these leaders and these elders, these deacons in these different churches were also edifying, and Paul was edifying those in the churches. For example, the church of Corinth, the brother who took his father's wife. So again, this is what Paul is speaking on in chapter 14. Is how one who is weak in the faith believes he may eat herbs, and one believes he may not eat meat but just herbs, and one he believeth that he may eat all things. So again, Genesis 9 and 3 and on down, that was up for interpretation. But we know now through the Spirit that those things, that the flesh is profitable, and things were separated to be clean and unclean, as stated in the law. And also you have to roast a lamb, you have to eat flesh for the Passover. But that's for another lesson, Lord willing. But again, let's read verse 5 in Genesis chapter 9. And surely your blood of your lives will I require at the hand of every beast, will I require it at the hand of man. At the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. So again, this verse was most likely up for interpretation at that time. Because it says, your blood of your lives will I require at the hand of every beast will I require it. So again, and at the hand of man. So it's talking about beast and man. So again, this is why Paul is addressing in Romans 14 and 2 that there is one who believeth that he may eat all things, another who is weak, which eateth herbs. So now let's bring out another precept to establish the fact that the flesh was given to eat also. And this is from the Torah. Slack here, bear with me 1 second. See if I can get this preset. This book of Genesis, chapter 7 and verse 2. Of every clean beast shalt thou take to thee by sevens, the male and his female, and of beasts that are not clean, by two, the male and his female. So again, the Most High established the flesh of beasts that are clean and unclean. And this is also outlined in the law, which we are commanded to consume and also to avoid. So now let's go back to the book of Romans. This book of Romans, chapter 14, we'll go back to verse 2. For one believeth that he may eat all things, another who is weak eateth herbs. Verse 3, let not him that eateth despise him that eateth not, and let not him which eateth not judge him that eateth, for God hath received him. So again, Paul is in this verse speaking to these Israelite foreigners who are just coming into the fold. And you have to keep in mind that these Jews and Gentiles were under a Roman captivity of the captivity of the Greeks and the Romans at this time. So there were things that were available and things that were not available as far as meats and things for them to consume and eat, which was most likely at a limited variety. Same way as in this current time in Babylon the Great, there are certain items which are forbidden because they are defiled by the ingredients that Esau, the so-called white man, puts in it, and these other nations. But let's address the fact that in this time, and also prophesied by, I believe in the book of Ezekiel, it was prophesied that we would eat unclean things among the Gentiles, meaning among these other nations. But let's address the fact that verse 3, Paul is telling these Jews and these Gentiles, let not him that eateth despise him that eateth not. Because the Most High, through Yahweh Bashim Yahushai, through Hamashiach Yahushai, and in his ministry commanding these Israelite foreigners to repent and return to the fold and to their former covenant, Paul is giving these instructions out to these churches for them to know what to avoid and how to edify and correct their fellow brethren, whether they be these Israelite foreigners coming back into the fold or these practicing Jews who were well versed in the Torah. So again, Paul was bridging the gap between these two groups, and you have to read it with that mindset. First, how it was written back then, instructions for them back then, so you get the proper narrative pat down, and also how things were written for us for today, and what things we are to take out of these lessons and apply in our daily lives. Because not all things are for us to be taken today, but were instructions for those back then. So now let's go to the next precept, 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 7. This is the book 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 7. And it reads, howbeit there is not in every man that knowledge, for some with conscience of the idol unto this hour eat it as a thing offered unto an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. So again, Lord willing, I'll go over this whole chapter on another lesson, but the point being that, let me just check the footnote I have for this. The point being that Paul in this verse is saying, and if you look at the different translations of this verse, what he's saying is that some consider idols real, so they are defiled by their conscience, and so they're defiled by the fact that they believe that this idol has consecrated this meat towards it, because again, during the time of the Greeks and the Romans, you know, these Jews and these Gentiles, these Israelite foreigners, you know, had a limited selection and variety of meats and drinks. But let's establish the fact that Paul is telling these Jews and Gentiles that these are the things that edify. So we go to verse 1, not as touching things offered unto idols. We know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffeth up, which these Jews were puffed up in that knowledge. They had that knowledge of the Torah and the examples given by the prophets. But charity edifieth. So again, this is that constant theme that Paul is pushing to these Israelite Jews, and these Israelite foreigners. That's true charity, to edify your brother and your fellow laborer. So let's go down to verse 4. As concerning therefore the eating of those things that are offered in sacrifice unto idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is none other God but one. So verse 7 speaks in Paul telling these Jews and these Gentiles, but not in every man is that knowledge, that the idol is just a standing image, and really that idol doesn't consecrate anything at all, nor is it profitable at all. So let's go to verse 8. But meat commendeth us not to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, neither if we eat not are we the worse. So Paul is saying, neither are we better if we eat it, and if we eat it not, are we the worse? Because again, we're not to offend our fellow believer, because it's again showing a improper conduct if we eat it and defile their conscience, because their conscience is already being defiled by their belief that an idol is anything. So again, this is all to build up those that are in the same faith, so that we may build them up not just in faith but in the scriptures. So let's go down to, and this is the topic of Romans chapter 14. So let's go down to verse 10, or read verse 9. But take heed lest by any means this liberty of yours becomes a stumbling block to them that are weak. So you're not to make stumbling blocks. And again, this is why you have to separate the things that were written in instructions to those back then, and separate what was written for us today to learn from and extract and apply today, because not all things are made to apply today. We can't go outside and go to an idol temple. Verse 9. But take heed lest by any means this liberty of yours becomes a stumbling block to them that are weak. So again, if you have that great faith and you have the great knowledge that that the Most High, that there's no such thing and power given to idols but to Yahweh B'Shem Yahushai, but you're not to create a stumbling block to your fellow believer and laborer. And keep in mind, during the time of the Greeks and Romans, there was many idols, many images, many temples, which these heathens, these Romans and Greeks had at the time. Verse 10. For if any man see thee which has knowledge sit at meat in the idol's temple, shall not the conscience of him which is weak be emboldened to eat those things which are offered to idols? So again, that goes into leading astray your people. And this was also outlined, let me see, in 1 Corinthians 6 and 12. So again, to get the proper understanding, you have to understand the proper narrative for what was written at this time, and how to apply it and line it up with the Gospels, and separate what was written for then and things written for today. 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 12. All things are lawful unto me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. So not all things are expedient, which is what Paul is saying. And let's go back to Romans chapter 14. Actually, let me bring out this other precept right here. Verse 11, and through thy knowledge shall the weak brother perish, for whom Hamashiach died. But when ye sin so against the brethren, and wound their weak conscience, ye sin against Hamashiach. Verse 13, wherefore if meat make my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh while the world standeth, lest I make my brother to offend. So again, this is an example that Paul gave to these Jews and these Gentiles, these Israelite foreigners. And also it was written and prophesied through Ezekiel that we would eat unclean things amongst the heathen. Salaki, amongst the Gentiles. So let's bring out that precept. This book of Ezekiel chapter 4 verse 13, I believe. And the Lord said, even thus shall the children of Israel eat their defiled bread among the Gentiles, whether I will drive them. So again, this was prophesied to happen through these various captivities that the Israelites would be scattered into according to biblical prophecy. So now let's go back to the Romans chapter 14. Book of Romans chapter 14 and verse 4. Who art thou that judgest another man's servant? To his own master he standeth or falleth. Yeah, he shall be holden up, for God is able to make him stand. So here Paul is making an allegory, a comparison about, who judges another man's servant, and that's the example given as another servant in the faith to the Most High. That man being the Most High, and the servant being that believer. So again, Paul is making the comparison to these two different mindsets. The Jew practicing Israelite, that he believed, but also he had that knowledge of the Torah and the examples given by the prophets. And you had these Gentiles come to the fold, these Israelite foreigners. So this is Paul speaking to these two groups. You judge another man's servant, to his own master, which he even in the Hebraic mindset, the word servant is used as a is synonymous for a believer, one who practices the and beliefs and the faith of the Torah and the prophets. But Lord willing, we'll go into that in another lesson. But let's stay on the main topic, which is edifying your fellow believer. This is what Paul is going over in Romans chapter 14. So this is why it says in verse 4, yeah, he shall be holden up, for God is able to make him stand. So again, God being able to make that person or that individual stand is through his faith, through his belief. And we are to build up our fellow believers, so-called Black, Hispanic, Native Americans, which are Israelites. This is why Paul spoke in chapter 12 the conduct that you are to have amongst those that believe and amongst those that are still caught up in these other doctrines and philosophies and man-made religion. So again, this whole epistle goes together. And 13 is touching on the hierarchy and how the hierarchy is made to edify the body. And how they edify the body, which is through the examples given by the prophets and through the law. So let me bring out this precept in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 20. So again, the topic here is, like I said in Romans 14 and 2, one believeth that he made eat all things, and one who is weak eateth herbs. So again, this is touching on the different beliefs that one may have and how we are to edify one another. And this is who Paul was writing. This is what Paul was writing to these Jews and these Gentiles, to these practicing Jews and these Israelite foreigners. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 20. But I say the things that which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils, and not to God. And I would not that ye should have fellowship with devils. So again, Salaki, let me just check my footnote real quick, see if I have something to give y'all. What is it? 20. So let's go up to verse 18. Behold, Israel after their flesh, are they not they which eat of the sacrifices, partakers of the altar? So again, like it was stated in Romans 14 and verse 3, you're not to despise your fellow believer that eateth or eateth not. But again, you're not to provide stumbling blocks to the fellow believer, as stated in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and on down. 8 verse 1 and on down. So this is why Paul is saying, that there were some of these Israelites, whether Jew or Gentile, that they were eating of the sacrifices, and were they not partakers of the altar also? So again, Paul is not saying that, everything is profitable, everything is clean. Again, he's giving different examples to teach these Jews and these Gentiles what to avoid and the things that are edifying or charitable to build up your fellow believer. This is why it says, 1 Corinthians 10 and 23, all things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things edify not. Verse 24, let no man seek his own, but every man another's wealth. So again, like it says in verse 20, that or verse 18, although it's not that eat the sacrifice, is also partaker in these other customs. So again, you're not edifying your fellow believer when you're doing these things, but you're actually creating stumbling blocks to them. And this is what it was spoken of in chapter 8. And in verse 1, this is why Paul said, knowledge puffeth up, but charity edifieth. So, and also, in verse 10, he says, for if any man see thee which has knowledge sit at meat in the idol's temple, shall not the conscience of him which is weak be emboldened to eat those things which are offered to idols? So again, you already have a a believer whose conscience was already defiled, like it was stated in verse 7, and believed that the idol actually consecrated the the what was offered to it. So their conscience is already defiled because they consider the idol to be real. But then you're further defiling, your fellow believer when they see you, like it says in verse 10, sit at meat at idol's temple, which means when you're sitting at meat, you're also participating in whatever whatever heathen practice is going on there. This is that stumbling block that you're to avoid amongst your own people, which Paul was teaching to these practicing Jews and these Israelite foreigners. Now, this is how we're not supposed to create these type of stumbling blocks for our people also. And this is why, certain people believe that just because verse 8 says that meat commendeth us not to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, neither if we eat not are we the worse. They take that and make a whole doctrine out of it. And these are doctrines that create stumbling blocks for our people. And it's also taken out of context. This is why you have to study and get the proper narrative and piece together the epistles with the gospel and the teachings that Yahushua Mashiach taught. Because all these things go hand in hand, as well as what was written in the prophets. But you have to first get that proper understanding of what was written in the epistles, how to piece them all together, and how that's goes together with what was written in the gospels and the teachings of Yahushua Mashiach, and get the understanding and separate what was written for back then and what was written and profitable for today. So again, let's go back to chapter 10. And verse 24, let no man seek his own, but every man another's wealth. So again, this is what Paul was teaching to these Jews and these Gentiles. Not seeking your own, although you may be puffed up in that knowledge, like it says in 1 Corinthians 8:1. You also seek another's wealth, meaning to build up your fellow believer, your fellow Israelite, so-called Black, Hispanic, Native Americans. And that's all through the scriptures and the spirit and power of Yahweh Bashim Yahushai. Verse 25, whatever is sold in the shambles that eat, asking no question for conscience sake. So again, Paul was touching not also on like I said in 1 Corinthians 8:10, those who are in the altar of the idols, in the temple of the idol, and who sit at meat, which also are those that are participating in the practices, in the heathen practices that are going on in these temples, in the idol's temple. This is why it says in chapter 10, verse 18, behold, Israel after the flesh are they which eat of the sacrifices, partakers of the altar. So you have to separate, these two things. Those who are participating in the idol's temple and also sitting at meat, which they're participating in customs of these heathens back in the time of these Greeks and these Romans. And Paul is making a division. He's showing that also, because of the fact that these Jews and these Gentiles were under the rulership of these Greeks and these Romans, he was also saying that there's another instance where you'll be in the marketplaces of these heathens, which we are also today, because many things are defiled, even today, as far as GMOs, certain ingredients that that are not lawful. Not just the obvious ones like pork, but also things like molasses, things like cabbage, things like tilapia, which are unlawful. But Lord willing, I'll go over that on another lesson, but let's keep moving in the lesson. So verse 25, whatsoever is sold in the shambles, that eat, asking no question for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So again, Paul is making the point that some of these things, back then, because they didn't have as well as a choice that we do today, neither the liberty that we do as far as the convenience that is given in this society, as far and the variety of selections. So all things are not profitable to take from the instructions given to those back then and apply them today. And this is why Paul, through the Spirit, he was saying all things are lawful, but all things are really not expedient, nor do they edify. So verse 25, he's saying whatever is sold in the shambles to these Jews and these Gentiles, because they were under the rulership of these Greeks and these Romans, don't make no question of it. But now today we know that we have a wider selection, and we're to be careful on the things that we consume, not just for the sake of defiling our fellow believers' conscience, but also for our health, because there are many poisons in these foods today, as far as GMOs, things like sushi. They have tapeworms, things of that sort. These are the things we have to avoid. Although it's lawful, because it's still fish, it's not expedient today. So we have to separate these things so we get the proper understanding on what is lawful and expedient today, and what were instructions given to these Jews and these Gentiles back then. And also, Lord willing, I'll go over this chapter. But the main point is, what I brought out, that there were those in the times of the Greeks and the Romans in these idol temples defiling, the belief and conscience of their fellow believers, whether it was Jew or Gentile, but also in these marketplaces, whether you were a practicing Jew or an Israelite foreigner. And this is why Paul is giving these instructions, which he's touching on in this chapter. Now let's go back to Romans chapter 14 and verse 4. Also, let me get this precept real quick. I believe it's First Thessalonians. This is the book of First Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 22. Abstain from all appearance of evil. So again, we're to avoid from the appearances of evil conduct, as far as not just how we act or how we carry ourselves, but also the things that we consume, because all things are to edify our fellow believer and build them up in the faith, and also as a proper example. This book of Romans chapter 14 and verse 4. And it reads, who art thou that judgest another man's servant? To his own master he standeth or falleth. Yea, he shall be holden up, for God is able to make him stand. Verse 5. One man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. So again, you have certain camps that will use this verse as a means to say that if you believe and if you're persuaded in your mind that this thing is supposed to be carried out a certain way, then that justifies you, but that doesn't. Again, what justifies you are the scriptures, the law, the Torah, and the example given in the prophets. Now let's go to this precept, Colossians chapter 2:16. There's a book of Colossians chapter 2 and verse 16. Let no man therefore judge you in meat, or in drink, or in respect of an holy day, or of the new moon, or of the Sabbath days, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Hamashiach. So again, let me check my footnotes for this. Slacking. So let's go up to verse 8. Beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Hamashiach. So again, there were certain of these Jews that were caught up in their traditions. And also these Israelite foreigners, these Gentiles, they're caught up in these heathen traditions and these heathen customs, partaking in the sacrifices of the temple of these idols. Verse let's go down to let me see, verse 21. Touch not, taste not, handle not, which all are to perish with the using after the commandments and doctrines of men. Which things have indeed a shew of wisdom and will worship and humility and neglecting of the body, not in any honor to the satisfying of the flesh. So again, what these practicing Jews were doing, caught up in their traditions and their commandments and their doctrines. But verse 21 saying to touch not, taste not, handle not, which is these unclean things. So let's go to the next precept. It's book of Galatians chapter 4 and verse 10. Reads, ye observe days and months and times and years. I am afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain. So Paul is speaking about these Israelite foreigners coming back into the fold, these Gentiles, and how some of these Jews, some of these proselytizers, which were getting these Israelite foreigners to circumcise themselves and immediately keep the law without showing them the principles of the law and the execution of the law, and also what Yahweh Shai Mashiach taught. So if you go to Galatians chapter 6, Galatians chapter 6 and verse 13. For neither they themselves who are circumcised keep the law, but desire to have you circumcised, that they may glory in your flesh. So it was these practicing Jews, immediately, after finding out the commission that Yahushua HaMashiach taught of these Gentiles, these Israelite foreigners, to return back into the fold, they immediately approached these Gentiles, constraining them, which pressuring them to circumcise themselves without teaching them the principal matters taught in the law and the examples given in the prophets. So this is why speaking in Colossians 2 and 16, about being judged in meat and drink, or in respect of an holy day, or of new moon, or of the Sabbath days, because again, you had these Jews and these Gentiles under the rulership of these Greeks and these Romans. So at that time, there were certain things as far as meats that were not available, as far as what was being sold in these marketplaces, or in drink. And also you had certain of Jews and also Israelite foreigners, Gentiles, which were under servitude, whether they were to their own people, or also which were still under bondage. So there were certain days that they weren't able to observe, whether it was new moon, Sabbath days, or regarding a holy day, because most likely their masters didn't give them leave. So this is where you have the concept of servant master. And that's a stumbling block for our people today, because we automatically read these things, and in our mind we're thinking, well, this is where the slave Bible concept comes from, or it's a slave Bible. This is what makes it a slave Bible. But slavery is not a new thing, but was a common back in the and still is in the Eastern world, but even in these times. This is why you're constantly reading the epistles, servant, obey your masters. And also it was a Hebraic concept, ibad, which meaning servant, which meaning it's merely just speaking on someone serving a higher power. So just to get the concept, and also you have to keep in mind, you had these Israelite foreigners coming back into the fold who weren't as built up as far as, how to keep the holy days, how to observe the new moons or the Sabbath. But they believed, they had that faith in Yahushua HaMashiach. And they believed in redemption for and calling back into their former covenants and customs. So let me see if I can get this precept real quick. Book of Acts chapter 22 and verse 28. And it reads, actually we'll start at verse 24. The chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle, and bade that he should be examined by scourging, that he might know wherefore they cried so against him. So this is when the Jews sought to assassinate Paul, because they believed that that he was teaching things contrary, to the law. So this is that the chief captain, bringing him into the castle, to find out what was going on. Verse 27, Then the chief captain came and said unto him, Tell me, art thou a Roman? He said, Yeah. So the chief captain, finding out that Paul was a Roman, because again, you were under a you were either a slave, under this time of the Romans and the Greeks, or you were a free man. So let's read verse 28. And the chief captain answered, With a great sum obtained I this freedom. And Paul said, But I was freeborn. So you had Israelites that were freeborn, and you also those that were born under a servant a master, but were able to obtain their freedom. And this was not just a common practice among Jews and Gentiles, but it was under these Greeks and Romans. So let's go back to Romans chapter 14. So again, this is why I said in Colossians 2:16, let no man judge your meat or drink. And also why in verse 3, it says, let not him that eateth despise him that eateth not, and let not him that eateth not judge him that eateth. Verse 4, who art thou to judge another man's servant? Because again, you had the Jews and Gentiles who were under servitude and were either born free or they were born under the servitude of to whom they were sold unto. So there was still slavery going on in this time, and it's not a new concept. Neither is it just something that just all of a sudden existed in the 1800s. So let's go back to verse 5. One man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. So, again, there were some of these practicing Jews. They esteemed every day alike as far as, their daily practices, ceremonial cleansings, whether they were fasting, whether, they did their praying every day. And again, you had these Israelite foreigners coming back into the fold who esteemed, maybe the Sabbath day above all the other days and consecrated it more, and or new moon days. But these Jews, these practicing Jews, were more or so dedicated as far as committing their practices on a day-by-day basis. Verse 6, He that regardeth the day regardeth it unto the Lord, and he that regardeth not the day, to the Lord he doth not regard it. He that eateth, eateth to the Lord, for he giveth God thanks. And he that eateth not, to the Lord he eateth not, and giveth God thanks. So again, you had, certain days that were, that were regarded, to the Most High, and certain days that weren't as regarded as far as, um, the things that were carried out in that day. So you had more dedicated people as far as, the Jews, and they were also more aware of their customs and practices. You know, you had these Israelite foreigners coming back into the fold, these Gentiles. And also this is speaking on, those eating on certain days and those fasting, and still regarding it to the Most High, because it is a time of humbling oneself. This is why it says, "Let not him that eateth despise him that eateth not." So you can also precept that with verse 3 as far as fasting. So verse 6, certain days you regard to the Most High as far as eating, and certain days they regard the Most High, and you don't eat in it, you abstain from eating. You can also precept that with chapter 11, verse 21. For if God spare not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. Going into these Jews and these Gentiles. And also, like it said in chapter 13 and verse 10, love worketh no ill to his neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. Going into, edifying your fellow believer. As far as, like it says in 1 Corinthians 8:1, knowledge puffeth up, but charity edifieth. So this is what Paul is doing and teaching throughout these churches of these Jews and these Gentiles. Verse 7, Romans 14:7. For none of us liveth unto himself, and no man dieth to himself. Verse 8, for whether we live unto the Lord, and whether we die unto the Lord. Whether we live therefore or die, we are the Lord's. And you can precept that with Romans 2:21. Thou therefore, which teachest another, teachest thou not thyself? Thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal? Verse 22, thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery, dost thou commit adultery? Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? So, this is going into what these, Paul speaking to these practicing Jews, and those that were caught up in their hypocrisy, partaking of these idol temples and sitting at meat, and defiling the conscience of their fellow believer, and also being shown as a hypocrite. This is why it says, verse 23, thou that makest thy boast of the law, thou through breaking the law dishonorest thou God. For the name of God is blasphemed among Gentiles through you, as it is written. So you had these Jews, blaspheming the name of the Most High, and also defiling the conscience of not just these other Jews, those who looked up to these rulers, which were hypocrites, but also they were defiling and showing the improper example to these Gentiles, which were Israelite foreigners. So, let's go back to Romans 14:8. This book of Romans, chapter 14, verse 8. For whether we live unto the Lord, and whether we die unto the Lord. Whether we live therefore or die, we are the Lord's. Verse 9, for this end Hamashiach both died and rose and revived, that he might be the Lord both of the dead and the living. So now another precept we can use is Salakia, bear with me. This is book of Romans chapter 10 verse 17, and this goes with Romans 14 and 7 and 8. So it reads, so then faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. So not also were these Israelite foreigners being built up by these comparisons that Paul was making, speaking to these two different mindsets, the mindset of the practicing Jew and the Israelite foreigner, the Gentile. Also, he is saying that your faith and is built up also by hearing of the word of the Most High. And also, we can go to chapter 5 and verse 20. And it reads, moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound, but where the sin abounded, grace did much more abound. So when these Jews, they had went off and had to offer a animal sacrifice, that was a form of grace. And also being used as an example of, these Israelite foreigners who had went off, but now were commanded and they were given that grace to return. So the Jews were denying that grace to these Israelite foreigners and despised their foreigner counterparts. Yet they were given the grace by offering animal sacrifice, which was a grace that they were given through the scriptures. And Romans chapter 7 verse 22, for I delight in the law of God after the inward man. So this is also a way that Paul was telling these Jews and these Israelite foreigners how they should build up each other, delighting in the law of the Most High God. Verse 9, for this end Hamashiach both died and rose and revived, that he might be Lord both of the dead and the living. The dead symbolizing, those that were dead, to their works, to their former covenant, who were caught up in these doctrines and philosophies, and in these customs, these heathenish customs of these Greeks and these Romans. And living being, these those who were still continuing in their customs, and to whom Yahawashi HaMashiach came to confirm the promises and also the to magnify the law. And these were those that were living. This is why it says in chapter 10 and verse 17, this book of Romans chapter 10 verse 17, Salaki 11:17. And if some of the branches be broken off, and thou being a wild olive tree, were grafted in amongst them, and with them partakest of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. So the branches being broken off were these Jews who denied Yahawashi HaMashiach, delivered him up, although they were called to repent. And the wild olive tree being these Israelite foreigners, these Gentiles, who were given a chance to return to their former covenants and customs, and they were both ultimately granted repentance and redemption, and they were justified in the forgiving of sins. Because again, it is written, all Israel will be justified. And the root and the fatness of the olive tree is the scriptures, the law, the example given in the prophets. through the power of Spirit of Yahweh Bashem Yahushai. Now let's go back to Romans 14 and 9. Let me see if I can get a precept just to go with that in the book of Proverbs. Slide here, bear with me. Okay. Book of Proverbs, chapter 21, verse 16. The man that wandereth out of the way of understanding shall remain in the congregation of the dead. So again, Paul, this is what he's writing in Romans 14 and 9. Because Yahweh Shai HaMashiach ultimately came to justify the whole seed of Israel, those dead and those living. Meaning, those dead to the works of the law and to the belief, and those also living and continuing in the customs and practices. But they were they were justified, although they lived in hypocrisy and were not executing the law as it was written. Now let's go back to the book Romans, chapter 14 and verse 10. But why dost thou judge thy brother? Or why dost thou set at naught thy brother? We shall all stand before the judgment seat of Hamashiach. For it is written, As I live, saith the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So then every one of us shall give account of himself to God. Verse 13. Let us not therefore judge one another any more, but judge this rather, that no man put a stumbling block or an occasion to fall in his brother's way. Like it was written in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 1 and on down. And also you can precept this with verse 6. He that regardeth the day regardeth it unto the Lord, and he that regardeth not the day, to the Lord he doth not regard it. He that eateth, eateth to the Lord, for he giveth God thanks, and he that eateth not, to the Lord he eateth not, and giveth God thanks. For none of us liveth to himself, and no man dieth to himself, but we are all to be united and built up in that faith, and also in the precepts in the scriptures. Now let's go back to verse 13. So that again, this is what Paul was instructing to these practicing Jews and these Gentiles, these Israelite foreigners, to be built up not just in the faith by hearing the word, but also delighting in the law, like I brought out, and also not judging one another, but edifying, building each other up, and not giving a occasion for a stumbling block, because you have some of these camps, they're stumbling blocks to our people, because they don't provide the proper narrative as it was written to understand and apply, and also how to put the pieces together with how things went down in the gospel and in the epistles and piece it all together. This is how you get that understanding. This is how you get built up in the spirit. Verse 14. Actually, let me get this precept real quick. So going back to Galatians chapter 4 and verse 10. So I know I didn't touch on it much, but when it says ye observe days and months and times and years, verse 11, I am afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain. So again, you had Paul, he went to certain of these Jews, practicing Jews and Israelite foreigners, these Gentiles, brought him the teachings of these apostles and the elders and Yahushua HaMashiach that he came to do in his ministry, and they received him. But also you had these other Jews, practicing Jews, who were approaching them and constraining them to those who had believed, they believed also, but they were doing the works of the flesh, which was ceremonial cleansing, circumcision, things that were not profitable. They were commanding them to keep the law immediately without building them up and the principles of the law and the examples given in the prophets. So let me see if I can get a footnote on that. This right here. Or you can actually go to verse 5. Actually, let me see. Galatians chapter 4 and verse 8. Howbeit, then when ye knew not God, ye did service unto them which by nature are no gods. But after ye have known God, or have rather known of God, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto ye desire again to go into bondage? That is, being the fleshly works of the law, without knowing the principles and the proper execution which Yahushua Mashiach came to taught. Verse 17, they zealously affect you, but not well. Yeah, they will exclude you, that you might affect them. So this was speaking on these other Jews who were approaching these Israelite foreigners and just, immediately teaching them to keep the law and to have themselves circumcised, just so they can claim them as their own converts. But they weren't built up in that true understanding, in that faith. So this is why he wrote about that allegory of Hagar and Ishmael and Isaac and the son of the free woman. This is why it says, and Lord willing, this is for another lesson, I'll bring it out. Verse 21, tell me that ye desire to be under the law, do ye not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman, born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by promise. So the son of the bondwoman, born after the flesh, was a symbolism of these Jews caught up in their traditions and not knowing the principal matters and executions of keeping the law, but were hypocrites. But the son of the free woman was those who had continued and been built up in the spirit, the Yahweh Shem Yahushai, and this is what Paul taught. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 1. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Hamashiach hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you, that ye be circumcised. If ye be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. Verse 4, Christ is become a none effect unto you, whosoever you are justified by the law, ye are fallen from grace. So, you had some of these Jews, they were, they knew the works of the law, but they denied the same grace that was given to them, and despised these Gentiles, these their foreign counterparts, and weren't properly building them up, but just immediately getting them to try to get them to keep the law and circumcise themselves so they can claim them as converts, and that's it. So let's go back to Romans chapter 14. And we'll go back to verse 14. Salakia. I know and I'm persuaded by the Lord Yahushua that there is nothing unclean of itself. Because Paul, he was built up in that faith. He had that strong faith. And he knew that although they were, under these Greeks and these Romans, and there was a limited, selection of clean meats, it was his faith that built him up, and his spiritual discernment to choose what was profitable and what didn't create a stumbling block for his fellow believers. But to him that esteemeth anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean. So again, he still made that division because he believed the things in the law and the prophets. So let me get this precept, 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 19. So again, you can't take one verse and make a whole doctrine out of it. And Paul is not authoritative to the law. He merely gave examples and also made comparisons and expounded on the law. First Corinthians chapter 9 verse 19. And it reads, For though I be free from all men, yet have I made myself servant to all, that I might gain the more. And unto the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law, as under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. So he became to the Jews as a Jew, as far as, what was dispensated to them in the law and their understanding that they had in the law, but also verse 21, to them that are without law, as without law, being not without law to God, but under the law to Hamashiach, that I might gain them that are without law. So even to these Israelite foreigners, he was slowly building them up, but again, he became as a Israelite foreigner, as a Gentile to them, as far as, not commanding them like these other Jews were doing, to immediately circumcise themselves and to keep the law immediately so they can claim him just as converts and just then, just leave them on their own. That's not what Paul was doing. Paul was building them up the correct way. Through what? Through the foundation, which is Hamashiach, the things that he taught throughout his ministry, and the apostles and the elders, and things that they taught, and which they all learned through the law and the examples given in the prophets. Verse 22, to the weak I became as weak, that I might gain the weak. I made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. And this I do for the gospel's sake, that I might be partaker thereof with you. So the gospel being, the good tidings, also the things, proclaimed in the prophets, in the law, and things that Yahushua HaMashiach taught himself. This is why he said in Romans 14 and 14, he's persuaded that there's nothing unclean of itself. Not literally speaking that nothing is unclean, but him, having that spiritual discernment and that great knowledge, like it says in 1 Corinthians 8:1, believing that an idol is not something that consecrates the meat or defiles it, but the belief in the idol is what defiles your conscience. So Paul in these marketplaces, he wasn't defiled by the fact that, a lot of these meats sold in these Greek and Roman marketplaces were consecrated to idols. But he knew that it was still a clean animal. So that didn't make it unclean, because it was consecrated to an idol. And, like I said in Ezekiel 4:13, that you would eat your defiled bread amongst the Gentiles. Paul knew that, the idol wasn't anything. So that meat was still clean, because it wasn't defiled through the idol, because the idol does not defile it. So this is why he said in verse 14, I know and persuaded by Yahushua HaMashiach that there is nothing unclean of itself, being those things sold in the marketplaces. But to him that esteemeth anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean. So an example being, if there was someone who thought that to be unclean, he would, for the sake of not defiling their fellow believer's conscience, then he would consider it unclean. Even though, he knew that the idol wasn't anything, and he was built up in that faith, that even though it was a consecrated meat to an idol, it was still clean because it was lawful to eat. So let's go to that precept in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, just to clarify a little bit more. What say I then, that the idol is anything, or that which is offered in sacrifice to idols is anything? Verse 25, whatsoever is sold in a shambles, take that eat, asking no question for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Verse 27, if any of them that believe not bid you to a feast, and ye be disposed to go, whatsoever is set before you, eat, asking no question for conscience sake. Verse 28, but if any man say unto you, this is offered in sacrifice unto idols, eat not for his sake that shewed it, and for conscience sake. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So again, this is an example that he's showing. Someone invites you to a feast, and something is set before you, just eat it without asking a question. Now you have to keep in mind that these things are not profitable today, but these things were written as specific instructions to those back then, because they were under a captivity of the Greeks and the Romans, and they were, although it was consecrated to an idol, you and your fellow believer, believes that the idol has any power, you're not supposed to eat, so you don't defile his conscience. Or whatever is sold in the shambles, meaning, it's not saying if pork is sold in the shambles. There may have been some lamb sold in the shambles, but they would tell you, look, we consecrate these to the idol so and so. but you're not supposed to be defiled by that fact, because nothing consecrates anything, because an idol isn't anything. But it's still lawful, because it's still a clean meat. Let's go back to Romans 14. And verse 15. But if thy brother be grieved with thy meat, now walkest thou not charitably, destroy not him with thy meat, for whom Hamashiach died. So the example that I just used in 1 Corinthians 9 and 19, being somebody invites you to a feast, and then they tell both of you that this is offered to an idol, and your fellow believer, mind you, this is specific instructions to those back then, that they tell you and your fellow believer, look, this is given to an idol. And your fellow believer says, he fears the idol, which is nothing, but you know that the idol is nothing, that you're not supposed to eat because you are defiling his faith. You're not building him up. You're not edifying him. So now you have to keep in mind that under the Greeks and the Romans, these Jews and these Gentiles were subjugated to these type of things back then. And not today. Now today we have a better liberty to choose what is clean and unclean as commanded in the law. Back then, it wasn't as easy. This is why Paul says, that we have to walk charitably to edify, like it says in verse 15. Because it doesn't say what was sold in the shambles. It doesn't say that it was it was pork, or it was lamb, which was clean, or pork that was unclean. But we know, and judging spiritual things with spiritual things, we have to understand that things are written for that time and things for written now. We should understand it in a manner that is with wisdom. So when Paul says, whatever sold in the shambles, eat for, we should regard that as something as using wisdom when we're doing these things today. But back then, we know that, whether you were a practicing Jew or an Israelite foreigner, you weren't going to willingly eat unclean foods anyway, because that would go against the whole principle and against the whole narrative of the whole Bible. So what this is actually talking about is meat sold in the shambles that were offered to idols. That's the true understanding. And there was those that believed that the idol had no power at all, and the idol was nothing. And there was those who were weak in the faith, just like in verse 3 when it says, he who is weak eateth herbs. So there were some who weren't built up in that faith, mainly these Gentiles, these Israelite foreigners, who believed that just because it was consecrated to an idol, that defiled the clean meat, the meat that was considered clean, that it was defiled, thus making it unclean. So you can't take just 1 Corinthians 9 and 19 and just turn that into a whole doctrine of saying, well, or 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and just saying whatever sold in the shambles that eat, and we can do that today. That's not what that's saying. Today we can use more wisdom when we have a wider selection. Back then they had certain meats that were offered to idols, and some believed that defiled it. So that's the whole point. Book of Romans, chapter 14, verse 15. But if thy brother be grieved with thy meat, now walkest thou not charitably, destroy not him with thy meat, for whom Hamashiach died. Verse 16, let not then your good be evil spoken of. Verse 17, for the kingdom of God is not meat and drink, but righteousness. So again, this actually, Paul is reiterating that, when he says the word righteousness, the righteousness is the righteousness of the law. So this doesn't justify you eating unclean meat today, neither did it justify these Jews and these Gentiles eating unclean foods like pork back then. But righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit and the Ruach HaKodesh. Verse 18, for he that in these things serveth a Mashiach is acceptable to God and approved of men. So, again, like it is written, the righteousness, that's the righteousness of the law. So Paul is not saying, that automatically to these Jews and the Gentiles, well, just because we're under the Greek and Roman captivity, you can eat pork and that's acceptable. That's not what it's saying. This is why it says in Romans 10 and 5, and it reads, for Moses describeth the righteousness which is of the law, that the man which does these things shall live by them. So he's not flipping and, going back and forth and backtracking. But Paul is telling you what the righteousness of the law is. That is keeping the commandments, being built up in that faith. The right way, through the power of Spirit of Yahweh Bashem Yahushai. Now let's go back to verse 19, Romans 14. Book of Romans, chapter 14, and verse 19. Let us therefore follow after the things which make for peace, and things wherewith one may edify one another. So again, Paul is speaking on edifying your own people, not creating stumbling blocks, which some of these camps do, and definitely so-called religion does. And this is what philosophy does. Verse 20, for meat destroyeth not the work of God. All these things indeed are pure, but it is evil for that man who eateth with offense. So eating with that offense is eating something like pork. That's unclean. Not only are you blaspheming the words of the Most High, but you're defiling your fellow believer's conscience. Because that it starts with that, and then he sees you in that idol's temple, like Paul said, and you're further defiling him, like it says in 1 Corinthians. Verse 21, it is good neither to eat flesh, nor to drink wine, nor anything whereby thy brother stumbleth, or is offended, or is made weak. Verse 22, hast thou faith? Have it to thyself before God. Happy is he that condemneth not himself in that thing which he alloweth. So you condemning yourself, although you may have great faith, is being offered to a feast of in the temple of an idol, which you had to accept at that time. There was most likely repercussions, and but just because you were invited did not mean that you had to eat. So if you were invited to the feast of that idol, and they would tell you this is offered to an idol, and your fellow believer, believes that that already defiles the meat, you're supposed to not eat it, because if you do, you're although you have that faith, you're condemning yourself because you're not building up your fellow believer. So again, this is what Paul is saying, verses 21 and 22. Verse 23, and he that doubteth is damned if he eat, because he eateth not of faith. For whatsoever is not of faith is sin. So again, Paul's words are not authoritative, but the law is authoritative. He merely expounds it and makes examples. This is an example. So you can't make a whole doctrine out of this, because that would be going against the law, Yahweh Shai, and everything that the Holy Scriptures stand for. So again, this chapter was on, building up and edifying, those who are, need to be built up in the faith. And 13 was speaking of the hierarchy. Chapter 12, Romans chapter 12 was speaking on how to conduct yourself amongst believers and unbelievers. So this is Romans chapter 14 breakdown. Hear, O Israel, again giving honor and glory to Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahushai. Say Shalom.